Here's what we're going to do to begin with. We're going to pass out a new part of the outline. That'll bring us up to date for this evening and for Sunday as well. Page 11, examples of the crisis prayer. Remember we were talking about that a long time ago. In Jesus' life, baptism, temptation, selection of the apostles, transfiguration, Gethsemane. Then in the early church, we looked in the book of Acts, and in our own life, times of marriage, important changes in vocation, calling, your first day of school, important crisis periods of one's life are times to pray. I do vividly remember my first morning in school, leaving the porch and crying most of the way there. The subjective side of prayer. I don't guess I should have told on myself, but you probably cried too. You skipped school your first day, is what you did. Modern scholarship's biased view of prayer subjectively. Remember what that's all about there? They say that prayer really doesn't do anything objectively. All it does is prepare you to accept fate, accept the inevitable. And a large part of prayer is the subjective part, to prepare you to accept things in life. But prayer also can change things. The balanced position of subjective-objective prayer. Objective prayer in the ethical context, the distinctive aspect of the Christian doctrine of prayer. The one thing that's distinctive, not praying in the name of our God, because other religions pray in the name of their God. It's a certainty of an answer. Only a God who's real, only the living God, can certify one's answer. Then miscellaneous spiritual deeds, prayer in the Spirit, all the way through the question of fasting. Then Christian character as fruit. An introduction, we looked at an exposition of 2 Corinthians 5, 14 to 17, which was the passive change. The old has gone and the new has come. An exposition of John 15, verses 1 to 6, the active change in character. That's the parable of the vine there. Then the first class of characteristics. Now, if you don't have it written down yourself, you'll have it all written down for you neatly and precisely here. Purity, holiness, godliness, righteousness. Page 12. First class dealt with an absence of inner moral defects. Second class, those three which relate to God. Faith, hope, and peace. Three that relate to God. Number 4, the third class of characteristics, those that relate to ourselves. Joy, temperance, contentment. I had so much to say on contentment, I didn't put anything down there on the outline. Tonight will be on dignity, and hopefully on Sunday morning will be on sound-mindedness. Third class of characteristics that have to deal with yourself. Joy, we've done. Temperance, biblical contentment. Tonight the message will be on biblical dignity, and finally sound-mindedness. So, are you ready for biblical dignity then? First word that we're dealing with is an adjective, semnos, S-E-M-N-O-S, that appears 4 times in the New Testament. Second word that we'll deal with is a noun. It's translated gravity, semnotes, very similar to this, as you can hear. Semnos, semnotes. S-E-M-N-O-T, long E, pronounced like a long A, an eta, and then an S. Semnotes. Appears 3 times. Translated generally as grave or gravity. Grave for the adjective, gravity for the noun. And not Newton's type of gravity. Although I guess you could say you got to keep your feet on the ground to be a biblically grave person. Grave 4 times. Always in the pastoral epistles with one exception. That means not always in the pastoral epistles, I guess I should say. Philippians 4:8 is the one exception. So it's a word that's very popular. It's always used by and only by the Apostle Paul. It's a word that's very popular in his writings to Timothy and to Titus, what we call the so-called pastoral epistles. It's a misnomer, but it's a popular phrase. Philippians 4:8, semnos, 1 Timothy 3, verses 8 and 11, semnos, Titus 2:2, semnos. Semnotes 3 times, the noun 3 times. 1 Timothy 2:2, 3, 4, and Titus 2:7. Now, before looking at the passages, let's study the Greek origins and meanings of this term. These two words, semnos and semnotes, come from a group of about 12 Greek words that are all part of what we can refer to as the seb category. That in its broadest sense possible, and anything relating to seb, S-E-B, is something broad. In its broadest sense possible means pious. It means pious. Words, there are 12 Greek words that come from this category. They denote various aspects of piety in a person. So without going any further, that is the underlying train of thought behind grave or gravity in the KJV, semnos, semnotes in the Greek New Testament, the subject of one being pious, the adjective, or piety, the noun. Originally, the words that were a part of this seb category, S-E-B, originally they meant to fall back, just like you'd fall away, to fall back, in the sense of shrinking away from an army in battle because of fear. The origins of meanings of terms are always very interesting to study. They give you a more realistic understanding and picture than of what the word means, let's say, in a derivative sense then. Originally, it meant to fall back in the sense of shrinking, one army shrinking away from another army in battle for fear of being overcome, for fear of losing. Then later, it took the meaning of the inner spiritual attitude of respect for something or someone as being lofty. In other words, your lowly state compared to their exalted one. So it went from a natural military meaning almost, a natural, carnal, run-of-the-mill military meaning of the fear, the disposition, the character of fear manifested in the fact that one army is falling away from the other army. And the word would be used here in the place of fall away or fall back. And as it was metamorphosized, it went from that to having an inner spiritual meaning of respect for something or someone. So it came to mean something that was august or venerable. Two good ancient English words that are fairly good descriptions of semnos and semnotes, august and venerable. Distinguished almost fits in another category, but you could even add that in there as a partial synonym, I suppose. Venerable, I suppose we know what the word venerable means. Venerable, V-E-N-E-R-E-B-L-E. Now, what do we mean by the use of the term grave? It's always translated in the KJV, or almost always, as grave. What do we mean whenever we say that was really a grave situation that person was in? What do we mean by that? Serious, exactly. Exactly what the English word grave means, besides the pit, the back of most churches. Besides that, serious. Grave means serious. But to get the full biblical Greek meaning, we're going to have to add two other words in here. Serious, worthy, dignified. Reading from Greek scholar Trench's book on New Testament synonyms, he's discussing several Greek words that are synonymous in some sense of the term, kosmios, and this term symnos that we're looking at here. He says how to render it, symnos, in English is not very easy to determine. On one occasion, that it qualifies things rather than persons, and it's been translated, this is one exception to grave, it's been translated honest over in Philippians chapter 4. On the other three occasions in the pastoral epistles, it's been translated as grave, whereas the noun symnotes is once as honesty and twice as gravity. So in KJV, it's either as honest or honesty or grave or gravity. Here, too, it must be owned that grave and gravity, these are the KJV renderings. Here, too, it must be owned that grave and gravity are renderings which fail to cover the full meaning of their original. The word, this is what I want you to hear, the word we want is one in which the sense of gravity and dignity, and of these as inviting reverence, is combined or compounded. A word which I fear we may look for a long time without ever finding. That's kind of the conclusion that you have to arrive at with the discussion of symnos and symnotes. What is an English equivalent for the Greek term? No such word exists in the English language. There is no one single term that is an equivalent for this Greek term. He says what we want is a word in which the sense of gravity and dignity, and of these as inviting reverence. That's why I gave you serious, dignified, worthy. If you're inviting reverence, it means you're worthy of someone's awe or someone's respect. The sense of gravity and dignity, and of these as inviting reverence, is combined. A word which I fear we may look for a long time without ever finding. And I tend to agree. I've tried to think of a word, venerable, august, distinguished, dignified, grave, worthy, serious, and nothing seems to fit. Some of those words are fine, but they're only partial definition, really, or explanation of what the meaning is here. We're looking for one word. You know, we would almost have to invent our own word. Give us the first two letters of serious and the next two of worthy and the last ones of dignified, and coin your own phrase, and there you'll have a good English word that would be a perfect synonym of symnos or of symnotes. Doesn't seem to really exist, so we're going to have to keep adding in this combination of terms. I have referred to it on your outline, and it will be the title of the message, dignity. We're not using the term grave because grave is a term that only means serious. And dignity can mean serious. A person who's dignified is a serious person, but they have other, almost unnameable, but they have other characteristics to them as well besides just seriousness. And grave, you run into the problem of the parking lot of the dead saints in the back of the church. And so to steer clear of that, we're trying to find some term that, although it won't be totally and fully expressive, it'll be as expressive as possible. And I think, in my estimation, that term would probably be dignity or dignified. So now go back to your understanding then. We said it took the meaning of an inner spiritual attitude of respect for something or someone as lofty, your lowly state compared to their exalted one. And of course it moved beyond just your attitude toward them to an actual virtue, to a characteristic of that individual that then would draw from you, elicit what was at one time felt to be symnos or symnotes. So it's something that inspires reverence, awe, respect. Something that inspires reverence, awe, and or respect is something that is grave in the KJV sense, dignified in our sense. something that is symnos in the Greek sense. Now, in the New Testament, it is said to be a characteristic specifically of deacons wives, of old men, and of younger men who are teachers. Those four categories are specifically delineated in the New Testament. However, that doesn't mean, of course, that we would restrict it to them. But those four are the four specific categories. Deacons, their wives, old men, and young teaching men. Let's look at that category right there that we have. We've got, in other words, we've got three groups of men, this category of grave or gravity. But it's not exclusively something that is to be, that we're to think of as a masculine characteristic or virtue, because the deacons' wives, by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 3, are commanded to be symnos and to have symnotes to them. So it does include women. What about age groups here? Well, without getting into, because the Bible doesn't deal with the subject of the age of a deacon or of his wife, it does say aged men, and if it says deacons and wives, that means they're married, so they're probably beyond the age of 20 anyway. Aged men, and it does happen to mention on one occasion young men as well. However, I think in most of our minds, and it seems to be generally true in the biblical presentation of it throughout the whole Bible, when you find other synonyms, whether in the book of Proverbs, somewhere in the Old Testament, or somewhere in the New, even outside of the use of these terms, grave and gravity, symnos, symnotes, you generally don't find references to younger people. Why? I think I've got the answer for that. You just look around you. Few younger people have the spiritual ability to command any reverence or respect from anyone. Few young people have that ability. Few young people have the Christian virtue of gravity, seriousness, dignity, of a venerable nature. Can you really think of a 25-year-old man as being venerable? I mean, that's contrary to the way we would normally think. And we normally think the way things normally are. And that's exactly right. Now, you can picture a 65-year-old man as venerable, but how can you refer to a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 35? Of course, you can go up to 90 and still have children. So we're not just concerned about the age, but it does seem to be true that it generally is dealt with in the context of certain age groups, with the exception of the young men over in Titus chapter 2. And even there, we may not be talking about anyone under the age of 40 anyway, 35 or 40, Titus. And the answer lies in the fact of what I've just said. Few young people have the spiritual ability. They fail to have the composure to command reverence and respect. Now, make a big distinction in your mind between this and asceticism. Asceticism always seems to come into our picture here, but it just does throughout the Bible. By the way, Tatian was an ascetic, one of the early founders of certain encrotite ascetic groups. We'll discuss that more next time. But you're running into asceticism throughout the church's history. It's just a natural tendency in man, and especially in man as a religious figure or as a religious character. No, a person who is ascetic, in our charismatic, we've all been raised in the charismatic movement, in our charismatic context, we might refer to that as a super spiritual person. We know what we mean by super spiritual. Someone who's really not spiritual, but they pretend like they're spiritual. They're super spiritual. They have all the little right phrases and tricks and treats and gimmicks, and they pray the longest and the loudest and read the most and witness the most, and super spiritual. And they'll correct you about anything, and at the same time they might be practicing that silent, quiet, ascetic life. Well, this is not a person who comes anywhere near the biblical, highly worthy Christian virtue of semnotes, gravity, dignity, worthy of reverence, awe, or respect. We have a lot of younger people in the church, so I guess I need to kind of camp out here for a while. That's why I'm laboring the point here. You'll find few young people, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Age brings dignity. Age brings gravity. I mean, it should. Let's say in, 90% of the cases, age brings dignity. Age brings gravity. Of course, we're talking about just a natural sense of dignity or gravity. There, in no sense of the word, is a person spiritually in awe or respect of that individual. And of course, we're talking about spiritually in awe or respect, where you reverence the individual. There are many people that could be classified out in the world as a dignified person. But are they really worthy of a Christian's admiration and respect? Probably not. Definitely not. Let me correct myself. If they're lost, definitely not. I just mean they're probably not going to have anything that even really resembles biblical virtues. Biblical virtues. Maybe good religious virtues, but biblical virtues that are worthy of admiration or respect. I think you'll find the cases of that few and far between. We're dealing with a church of people, and of course in the first century probably we're dealing with a lot of young people who are converted. The statistics of the study of missions, whether urban or rural, tend to prove that the people that are converted for the most part come in a certain category, age group of people. And they're not in their 50s, and they're not in their 60s, and they're not in their 70s, and they're not in their 40s, and they're not in their 30s. They're in their 20s or under, are generally the people that are converted. So we're not just dealing with ourselves here, we're dealing with all of Christianity then. Most people, when they are converted, most people are converted underneath the age of 30. There's just no way a person could dispute that. The facts and statistics are plentiful in that area. So we're dealing with young people in general. And our problem, your problem, my problem will be in this area, those of us who are beneath the age of 30, 40, 50. As I say, you can have people that lack dignity who are old enough to be your grandparents. But for the most part, younger people will have the problem that they lack the spiritual ability. They lack the natural composure that it takes to command reverence and respect. We mean by command that you draw it from people, elicit, not that you're commanding them to. You know how I'm using the term command. So it's something really to meditate on in your life. I think about this and have thought about it. I happen to fit in one of those categories of a teacher and a young man that is younger than the older men. So you can't be 60, you have to be 40 or 35 or under. And I fit in that category, and it's a command over in Titus chapter 2 to practice semnotes, to practice gravity. Now, when I say practice, it's not something like you're going to get up the next morning and say, I'm just going to do it today. Where's that box of gravity? Where did my wife put that? I'm going to get some of that out, and I'm going to use this today. No, you've got to have such a personality to you. Oh, we're getting right on the doorstep of biblical psychology here. Because I'm always hearing people, I've heard them all my life say, now wait a minute, you can't impose certain personality traits on people. Oh, yes, you can, too. That's what virtues in the Christian faith are all about. That's what they're all about. You can't impose this dignity on me. Oh, yes, we can, too. If we can't impose that on you, we can't impose faith, peace, joy. So you think we can do those. Why not these? All of a sudden, these really touch home. Because people just think of joy as when you go to church and be joyous. But you mean I've got to have such a demeanor to me. We're going to get into a full application and explanation of it here in a moment. Because we've still got to deal with the subject of, well, Jesus said be like a little child. And have you ever seen a dignified, a serious, or a grave child before? So what are we going to do there? We're going to have both of them. They're not mutually exclusive. They're complementary of one another. We've got to understand what it is in a child we are to possess, what it is from a child we are to manifest, and of course what it is we are not to possess or manifest. So younger people, younger men, younger women, pay attention. Few young people. Have you met very many people underneath the age of 25 that you were in admiration over them? in their composure, the way they spoke, the way they walked, the way they talked, the way they handled themselves. I haven't met very many people under 25, maybe under 30, that I could say I look up to. I would like to pattern myself after that individual. They are a dignified, worthy of reverence, worthy of respect individual. You see, we don't find people like that because of the fact that younger people generally lack both a natural as well as a spiritual ability. Even if you're saved when you're 10 years old. Just because you're saved when you're 10 doesn't make you a spiritual giant or a natural giant. You'll probably come to spiritual maturity before you'll even come to natural maturity. If you're converted way back in the crib days or something, you've still got to go through that process of the teenage years, the early marriage years, the midlife years, the crisis years when you need crisis prayer to help, to get on up into old age time, and hopefully by then you've really got a monopoly on biblical gravity and dignity. Although I think I've seen a few who have lacked it. Whenever they got the baptism of the Holy Spirit, they surrendered all of their dignity and gravity. Well, and that would bring up the question, can we praise the Lord and shout and dance and jump and be dignified? You want to answer that question for me? Well, of course you can. You have to be able to, or the Bible wouldn't say shout and praise God. Yes, you can shout and praise God. There are certain forms of shouting and praising God, however. Oh, how far should I get into that? Not very far. Not very. What about, I'll just say one thing then, praise God. What about those earlier days when we used to do these little funny jigs and these little motions with all of our songs? I don't know if that's Christian dignity there. It's quiet with a few laughs interspersed out there. I don't know. When you really get into the Bible and you think about things, I can see running through the meadow, lifting up your arms, praising God, jumping right here in church. But then there's a certain form of things where the person is obviously lacking in biblical dignity. I'll never forget the fact one afternoon, years ago, whenever the church first started, and another brother was leader of the church then, he called me up on the telephone one afternoon just to ask my advice. I think he already had his mind made up and his conclusions already he had arrived at, but to ask my advice about a situation in the church that seemed to be causing problems, probably causing problems with people who didn't belong in the church to begin with, because it was a new beginning, a new church, and everybody deserved to lack dignity back in those days. But in some areas of dancing and twirling and hopping and skipping and leaping and is this really the thing to do? And, we talked about that and said, that's really not the thing to do. It's causing problems, and probably it's causing problems not only because of the fact that maybe we have some insincere, unspiritual people in there who have not just recently had their heart renewed and their youth renewed like the eagles, like the rest of us had felt at that time, but maybe because it's out of the confines of biblical truth. Well, anyway, gravity, symnotes, it's the opposite of silliness. Silliness. A child many times is just silly. It's the opposite of silliness. Now, don't read into that, dear friend, something I didn't say. I didn't say that whenever you approach your 1-year-old, you have to speak in dictionary terminology to the child and say, I will meet you on your level whenever you can meet me on mine. That's not what I'm talking about at all. You end up having to be sometimes silly with your children. That's not what I'm talking about. But is that your character? Is that your makeup? That's another issue then. Don't read into this something that I'm not saying. Be sure that you hear what I am saying. You can be silly around your own child. That doesn't prove that you're a silly person, though. That doesn't prove that you get carried away with silliness. If you do, if that's your nature, if that's your general character or makeup, then you're not a grave, dignified, worthy of respect and honor, serious type of individual. All joking, jesting, the frivolous, unconcerned non-serious way is unbecoming of the Christian. Now, did I just say that you couldn't tell a joke? No, I didn't say that. The joking, jesting, clowning, frivolous behavior and manner of life is unbecoming of the Christian. One day when we really get deep into specific passages of maybe Paul's writing or Jesus' teaching, you'll be amazed at the humor that exists there. And dry humor is, in my opinion, the best humor. You know, when you have to tell a joke and then you have to tell the reason why it is a joke, you know you really had a good joke then. You know how you tell a joke whenever you're a child, they're just stupid little things. But a good joke teller, there's so many ins and outs to what he's saying, and then nobody laughs. You have to tell them why this is supposed to be rather amusing. Oh, ha, 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 ha. Then everybody gets it all of a sudden. Good dry humor. Good joke. You're a bad joke teller if you're like me, if you always laugh at your own jokes, though. That's proof that you're no good. I always seem to get choked up over my own. I guess I'm getting choked up over the fact you get choked up over my jokes. So you're not supposed to be a good joke teller if you smile through them. Keep a stern, serious face. I could if I want to, but who wants to practice asceticism like that? It's unbecoming of the Christian who realizes that life is not a game. See, we just had fun there for a moment on a dignified tape. So we're having to practice what we're not saying, I guess, is what I should say.
For the continuation of this
Fun there for a moment on a dignified tape. So we're having to practice what we're not saying, I guess, is what I should say. The joking, jesting, and I can say carefree, but put it in the right context, though. See, you should be carefree in the sense of you lack anxiety in your life. You're carefree. But there are some people who are carefree, and it's because they've never even thought of the subject of anxiety. Things like that, things like responsibility don't even enter their mind at all. That person's a carefree person, but they're carefree in a different sense than Matthew 6, Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7 has reference to. And that's not what we have reference to there. We've got reference to those who lack responsible characteristics and responsible traits to them, who lack conscientiousness. You've ever had someone speak of you as that young man, young woman is really a conscientious worker. That's a good quality for which you should be praised. To be conscientious. A lot of people aren't. I can say, by the Lord's help, that that's been said of me for years now. Everywhere that I've worked before, people have always said that I've worked very conscientiously. I'm very concerned about what I do. That's not boasting. I'm supposed to have that virtue, so I shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that I've got some of that virtue. You shouldn't be ashamed of the fact you have it. You should be if you don't. A conscientious worker. I don't like seeing a little tiny thing out of place. And too many people are just, everything is like a tornado, whirlwind, a hurricane hit the area. And you wonder, where were you brought up, a barn or in a home? Some barns are neater than some people's homes. It'll spill over into every area and aspect of your life. Is the individual a conscientious worker? They're responsible. They're very concerned about things. Well, you're on your way to gaining some dignity and some seriousness to you that people so much need. So I'm going to go over that again. The joking, jesting, frivolous manner of life is unbecoming of the Christian who realizes that life is not a game, neither is it a big joke, but that the Christian calling must be taken seriously. I remember the little nursery rhyme I was brought up with, row, row, row your boat. And I was accustomed to a certain ending to that little nursery rhyme until I got to be a certain age, like up in my early teens or something. And it went from row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 to life is such a scream. And that was the funnest thing for everyone to run around school saying. You thought they were going to end the regular way. And they end, life is such a scream. But you know what? Life is not a scream. Life is not a game. Life is not a big joke. As children, and particularly teenagers, children don't really make it into a joke. They just make it to be a lot of fun, and that's fine. Teenagers too often make it into be a big game. It's a joke. With their cars, with their drugs, with their lack of discipline, with their lack of respect of their elders. They make life into an endless merry-go-round of games, of having a lot of fun. What's the purpose? What's the purpose? There's no purpose. Oh, I pray that God gives our family the grace to teach my wife and myself, our children, to be different than so many teenagers out there in the world are. They get up 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. What are your plans? 19, 20, 21. You got any plans? 22, 23, 24. When are you leaving home? 25, 26, 27. We're going to increase the rent. 28, 29, 30. Oh, boy. Now your mind is frazzled on smoking marijuana for so long. You don't know what's going on, and you go try to find a job now. And you get one with the sanitation department is where you get one. You've wasted your whole life. So many teenagers are like that. They'll go right through those teen years, right through those 20s, living with mom and dad. Because they're irresponsible. They're not responsible people. Not responsible at all. Get a job, they get fired. Why did they get fired? They're no good. Was it because the company folded and they got fired? No. It was because they folded on the company, and the company fired them. Well, it's one thing to get fired. Depends on the reason for getting fired, though. I don't know if I've been fired. Oh, yeah, I have been fired, too. I fired at a Bible school one time. That was the worst place to get fired. But if you get fired, hopefully it's for a good reason. For a good reason. Because maybe you're doing your job too well. Some superiors don't like that. If you do your job too well, better to get fired for that than for not doing your job well enough. Moule, in his book, an idiom book of the New Testament, says this word, semnos, points to seriousness of purpose and to self-respect in conduct. I'm going rather slowly, but these are so weighty. Every time I get here, I'm just amazed at these little sentences I have written down here. You really think about this. This word, this virtue, points to seriousness of purpose. Do you have any goal in life? That's the chief thing that keeps my family operating. We've always got something we're striving toward. Too many people just don't have anything. There's nothing. There's nothing. That's not biblical contentment, by the way, just to be sitting there, well, there's nothing going on. There's always a goal. You want to further yourself in this area. You want to accomplish that over in that area. And you're setting about it in the quickest way possible, in the wisest way possible, to do something about it. Seriousness of purpose. Too many people don't have any purpose in life. If they have a purpose, they're not serious about it. You're never too young to start getting serious about life, to start getting serious about having a purpose and a goal in life, an ambition, something to strive toward. Something in the biblical confines in Christianity, but still a goal, something to strive for. We probably at this time in the church couldn't hear enough about this. I think it's something that we do need to hear and that we need to be reminded of. This word points to seriousness of purpose. Moule goes on to say, and it points toward self-respect in conduct. You see, someone, I guess, could have self-respect in their conduct, but it's because they're deceived. They have an improper, biased opinion of their own life and of themselves. You have to have some measure of maturity before any of this really fits what I'm quoting from Moule or what I'm quoting from my own notes and thoughts here. You have to have some measure of maturity. Oh, by the way, I guess maturity would be another word Not a synonym, but a semi-synonym that fits in here with symnos and symnotes. You'll never be a dignified person without being mature. You can't be. How could you be dignified and immature? You see, those are mutually exclusive of one another. Seriousness of purpose. I hate to get off of that. Seriousness of purpose. That keeps people working. Keeps the pedals on the bicycle wheeling around. When you know you're going somewhere. If someone doesn't know they're going anywhere, they don't even get on the bike then. You get on, you know you're going somewhere, and every revolution of the wheel moves you further toward that goal, whatever it is you're striving after. Too many people just want to recline and let life overtake them. And for the Christian, that's not true. You've got to set something in your mind. You are going to overcome life, not sit there passively and have life overcome you. Norman Vincent Peale message this evening, folks. We're really preaching to you. Positive thinking, positive confession. Set a business goal in your life. Well, we're talking not just about business, not even primarily really about business. I'm just talking about your whole outlook on life. Having a serious outlook on life. And having self-respect. Self-respect. Crucify self, the Bible says. Well, you can end up with such a haggard, crucified self on a cross, you don't have respect for yourself, and nobody else does either. I've met people like that. This concept must be taken along with the message of joy. We need to correlate these. It has to be taken along with the message of joy. In other words, a grave man is not a man who acts as though he has one foot in it. That man is not a joyous man. A play on words because the words are exactly the same. Be grave, be serious, be in the grave. No, a grave man is not a man who acts as though he has one foot in it. That man has no joy or enthusiasm. To take this along with joy, we might say that the heart may be filled with lightness, in that nothing is weighting it down. But he is not to express the silliness and the frivolous character of a child. You see, joy is not silliness. Joy is a pure heavenly virtue. I guess we'd have to make that distinction to begin with. Joy is not silliness. Joy is not running around the building, yelling at the top of your lungs, jumping and clapping. That could be an expression of it. It could not be. That's not joy, though. We've already described joy before. It's a virtue that's not found in other systems. It's a virtue that was almost looked upon as a vice because it seems to be effeminate when you raise your hands or express any type of enthusiasm about anything. Only women get excited. Only women get excited and cry, as the saying goes. Well, that's not true at all. Men who have any basis in the Bible at all get excited, they have enthusiasm, and they cry as well. If they don't, they have a problem. If they don't, they've got this false sense of maybe American masculinity or something to them. And you'll find a person like that is not the best person after all. We're back to the square-jawed, indifferent Clint Eastwood type of presentation, which is not what the Bible presents at all. So how do we take the two together? Well, the heart may be filled with lightness. See, dignity doesn't mean that you're so grave in the English sense of the term that you're anxious about the future because all of these cares are loaded upon your shoulders. No, you don't have cares in that sense as a dignified person because you have joy. Joy gives you lightness of heart. Lightness of heart in that nothing is weighting it down, but not the silliness of a child. Want to know maybe exactly what this symnos or symnotes is? Well, you almost have to try to find someone. Is your father like this? Your grandfather? Some elderly saint, some elderly soul that you picked out in the past? You can pick out in your own mind people that you've met in the past who both fit and fail to fit in this virtue of biblical gravity, KJV, gravity, or being grave in nature or character. You could even pick people out here right in the church. Then ask yourself the question about them: do they strike any fear, in the spiritual, biblical sense, where you have a respect for that person because of their holy, and not a passive but an active, their holy relationship with God, their holy standing before God? And ask yourself, do they strike any reverence or awe and fear in me? That's a good way to test whether or not that person is dignified or not. Don't go tell them that they are and if they aren't. But then you use that as a barometer for yourself. Now, am I like that person? If I'm like that person and they don't have dignity, then neither do I. Does that person strike any reverence in my heart? Do they seem worthy of commendation, respect, admiration? Should I emulate them? Should I copy them? Or is that, when I look at that person, I just think, oh, they don't really have things together in their life. They don't really have their head screwed on correctly. Or if it's on there correctly, it doesn't have all the marbles in it once it's on correctly. There's a person who's not a grave individual. There's a person, of course, whom you would not want to copy. Would that be a person you would want to pray for you in a serious situation? Would that be a person that you would respect the spiritual advice they would give you? How many times have you asked 4 people the same question and gotten 4 answers? 4 people and gotten 4 answers. You need to ask yourself, who would I really like to ask for some spiritual advice? You're going to have to find someone who's dignified, who has dignity and maturity to them. If they are, and I can think of some who are, the odds are they'll probably give you sound advice. Why? Because they're a mature, stable, dignified person themselves. I have a footnote about this business of looking around in the church, though, or of thinking and speaking of dignity in this context. Just because someone comes up to you and tells you that you strike awe in them, that doesn't mean anything, because the person may be spiritually immature themselves. In other words, if a spiritually immature person comes up to you and just says, "Oh, what a great saint of God you are," who's he to know anything? I am thinking of one situation. Yes, whenever I pause, sometimes my mind is going back X number of days, months, years. This time it's years, and thinking about a certain situation where, you'll have little traveling ministers come around, and the little teeny boppers that sit out there, and they hear this fella, he's been on drugs, rock and roll. He played with Black Oak, Arkansas, and rode with Hell's Angels. And now he's a Jesus lover now. And he's an evangelist now. And those little 14-year-old boys would just sit out there, my, what a man of God. He's probably not, my, what a man of God. Just because of all of this past association that he's had, that's what attracts that 14-year-old to him. It's an artificial attraction there. It's not a biblically based attraction, and by that I mean based on Christian virtue. It's based on an artificial, immature outlook on the man's past associations. Now, have you met anyone like that before? Have you ever been like that? I think I was like that at one time. I got converted when I was 15. So I was converted my whole 16th year. And you look at a 24-year-old who's already been, the whole way of the whole world. He's old and grizzled now. He's been through the whole scene. 24, and, you go up to them and tell them, what a man of God. Then whenever you get 34, you think, what a punk that fellow was. You don't think that until you're 34, though. So beware if someone after the message comes up and tells you you're very mature. If they're immature, I wouldn't trust what they're saying. Let's go back to the text here. Back to them. We haven't looked at them, but I have mentioned them. The versions give such translations as respectful, grave, serious, reverent, and dignified, among other things. Generally speaking, I would opt for the latter of those. Dignified and dignity. As long as we remember the ideas of seriousness and worthiness, those three words have to go together. Dignity, seriousness, and worthiness. Praise God. Maybe I'm even convicting some of you tonight. Well, we've got deacons, deacons' wives, and elder men in the church. We've got all three categories. So they can be looking at their own life, but you need to be looking at yours as well. Philippians 4:8 we'll begin with is the only passage outside of the pastorals where the term is found. Was translated honest, as we read in Trench, and I tend to agree. They just needed to kind of complete the word honorable, and you'd probably have a good translation here. Notice that in the KJV you have venerable. That's a good word. It's a very good word, but it's an antiquated word, though. The NIV renders this as noble, which is just not a good translation. Noble does not express the same thing as honorable, venerable, dignified. Finally, brethren, I'm reading in the KJV tonight, though, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honorable. In this context would probably be the best translation. Whatsoever things are honorable. Now that will be the only place where things are referred to as dignified or honorable. In other words, whatsoever things are worthy of your respect, then think on these things. But honorable would be a good translation here. For us, though, we're more concerned about the pastoral epistles. So with that, let's jump over to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2. We'll look at each one of these cases here. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2. Have your scissors and paste or your editing pen ready. For kings and for all, I exhort therefore first of all that you pray. For kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. Where they got that word, I really don't know. Where the NIV got holiness here, I really don't know. But it's not the word for holiness. It's not the word for honesty. It's a word for dignity. That would be the best translation. I've told you before about that old NIV. It's the best version probably available, but doesn't mean we won't get our scissors and paste out with it. NIV here has holiness, godliness, and holiness. We've already discussed holiness before, and no such term appears here. It's the word semnotes, dignity, that we might lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. Okay, chapter 3, verse 4. Now here we've got, first of all, we'll look at the qualifications for the pastor. A man who desires the office of a pastor desires a good work. And here are some of the qualifications. Verse 4, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all respectfulness, would be my own personal translation of that. And the NIV is similar, has respect, just the sentence is worded a little bit differently there. It has the same meaning, though. But you have to have respectfulness for it to fit into the KJV thought pattern. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all respectfulness. see, he's probably really not saying, you children be dignified, but you children respect the dignity of your father, which means that he will be ruling you well, ruling his house well, having his children in subjection with all respectfulness. It just, I guess, grieves me and irritates me at the same time. Whenever you're out in a shopping center or something and you hear a 16-year-old swear to his dad or something, or his father will ask him to do something, he'll say, "Get lost, old man." You just cannot comprehend. I mean, it's the father's fault. It's not the son's fault. It's the father's fault, who he so much lacks the quality of dignity that his son is not respecting him at all. And you would think that he would need to backhand his son, but he failed on backhanding years ago. It probably won't do any good now. Verse 8. That was for the pastor. Verse 8. Likewise must the deacons be dignified. Likewise must the deacons be dignified. NIV has respect again. Not double-tongued, not given to much wine, and not greedy of filthy lucre. Lucre. We don't use that term anymore. Verse 11. Even so must the deacons' wives be dignified. The deacons and the deacons' wives both begin in this list of virtues commanded of them with the same one, semnotes. They must have dignity. Even so must their wives be dignified. Now that doesn't mean to wear white gloves and have a poodle sit in your lap all the time. That's a stereotype, but a false sense of the term of dignity. Not slanderers, sober, and faithful in all things. Then over in Titus, pastoral epistles, Titus chapter 2, verse 2, aged men. Aged men. So I could name which of you this doesn't apply to then, but I won't embarrass you. But if you're an aged man, you aged men, be sober, dignified. Right up there at the top of the list again. Be sober, grave. Graves is an okay word, but all that expresses to us in English now is seriousness. And we need more than seriousness. Dignified, dignity has a few different connotations. And then finally in verse 7. That covers 7 times then. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded, in all things showing thyself. Now he's speaking to Titus. In all things showing thyself a pattern of good works. In doctrine showing uncorruptness, dignity, sincerity. Sound speech that cannot be condemned. In doctrine showing uncorruptness, dignity, sincerity. Okay, let's round this out with our little definition then of semnotes. I would define as that virtue or characteristic exemplified by a mature, serious outlook on life, coupled with worthiness of reverence and respect. That gets in the 3 words, the ideas behind the 3 words that we've given you before: serious, worthy, and dignified. That virtue or characteristic exemplified by a mature, serious outlook on life, coupled with worthiness of reverence and respect. Now here we're touching on one that not a whole lot of people in this church, in my opinion, have. So it's not like we're just breezing through these virtues and you're just chalking them all up. Yep, I've got that one. Yep, I got number 2. Yep, I got number 3. Yep, I got number 4. semnotes. Do you really have this? If you don't, then it's a virtue that has to be worked on. See, it's commanded in all these passages. It fits different categories of people, but look at all the different categories. Old men, old women, deacons' wives, pastors, young men who are teachers. That tells me it covers all of us as Christians in. That tells me it can't be restricted just to 2, 4, 6, 8, however many categories of people. That it covers all of us as Christians. And think about what we're talking about here. Doesn't the rest of the Bible, whether it uses the term or not, isn't that the message of the book of Proverbs, of other portions of Scripture? Whether it's addressing itself to old people or young people. There's nothing wrong with being a pleasant person, fun to be around. You're not a person who acts as though you have one foot in the grave. You're a pleasant individual, good-natured. You know how to tell a dry, humorous joke. You know how to catch one as well. You're probably mature if you know how to catch one. You know how to catch one as well, but you're not silly. You're not silly. You're fun, you're happy, you're joyful, you're enthusiastic, but you're not silly. You think about this. This is really a message I want you to think about. You're not a silly person. You're enthusiastic and you're joyful. But you're dead serious about life, because life is a dead-end game, as we started off in ethics saying. It kills everyone who participates. It's a dead-end game. And you have to be dead serious about life, what your goals are, what your plans are, what your outlooks are upon life.
It's all in